What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some of my pet peeves for CRPGs, in what I hope will make for a fun little video, because while I love them dearly, I would say if you play enough CRPGs, or any genre of game really, you will eventually start to notice little things that tend to be like pitfalls and things that can happen that are just slightly annoying. They're not really deal breakers for me personally, but over time they do tend to grate on you a little bit. Like when you've been married to the love of your life for a long time and they still won't chew with their mouths closed at the dinner table. Now, that said, some of these are, I would say, potentially a little more specific to me. Some of them are things that the genre has been trying to address and being met with, I would say, various levels of success personally. But why regale you with the details when we can simply jump in and talk about them? So I'm going to start off very simply with one that I think is probably a little more ubiquitous, you could say, because it really does transcend genres, and that is save files that are not separated out by your character. Now, this isn't a deal breaker or anything, but it is slightly annoying, and it annoys me in particular probably more than most people because I do this for a living, make content. And I do in fact make this a little worse on myself unnecessarily, because one thing that I do that isn't, I would say, entirely necessary is I keep an archive of save files for all of the games that I have played. Steam Cloud will also do this sometimes for you. You can upload them to the cloud and everything, but I keep like an actual archive of the save files I have. And the reason I do that is both so I can load up two specific moments in case I need to record something or if I want to check something out. And for no genre of games is that a larger task than CRPGs. I will often have hundreds to potentially thousands of save files across multiple characters for these games. And as you can imagine, that is a lot to sort through if the UI for loading said save file is just one very long list. This is something I'll usually try to scope out pretty fast, because if the possibility of naming your own save files is the case, if they are especially not sorted out by character, what I will do is I will go in and apply a sort of naming convention to the save files to help with my own archive, if nothing else. And while this is a problem that has gotten better in recent years, I would say plenty of games have kind of gotten the memo about separating them out as characters. It still does occasionally pop up. Now that one is a little more cross-genre, let's say. So from there, let's dig into the next one here, which I think is a twofold problem for CRPGs actually, though it certainly applies to other games as well, because it is the idea of bad stealth, basically. So bad stealth is not unique to this genre, yes. However, I will say bad stealth pops up in two different ways when it comes to CRPGs. And that is stealth in a game that has no stealth system, or party-based stealth checks, especially in games that you only have one character who's really kitted out for stealth to begin with. But the easy one first, some games don't have a proper stealth system, but they do occasionally have stealth missions in said games, which is always very silly. To give a recent example, you've got Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. It has a stealth mission in it. It does not have a stealth system in it, which makes that mission very annoying. But then there's the other side of this. So some games will have a stealth system, and you may well have a character that is spec'd into stealth, except you're playing a CRPG and the focus tends to be on your larger party, which makes utilizing that stealth system a gigantic hassle that more often than not just isn't worth it, even if the stealth itself isn't necessarily bad. In those cases, your best case scenario is usually to get the person who can stealth to either allow you to avoid an encounter by simply going in, stealing the thing and getting out, completely on their own, or just using them to set up a more advantageous position when the combat breaks out. Some games, however, are simply not that flexible, and because of the nature of how you control the party and potentially the camera angle and everything, trying to effectively use this stealth system is at best going to be a micromanagement nightmare, or you simply can't use it at all because it may well be checking against your entire party, etc., etc. Long story short, stealth in CRPGs tends to be tricky. I think Pillars of Eternity 2 does it pretty well with singular characters. As a party, it can be difficult to do, but within that style of CRPG, I think they do a really good job with it. But then, of course, we have the CRPGs from Larian Studios. I actually do think that those games from Larian handle stealth the best, which is in large part, I think, down to the fact that the way their camera and the setup of the game world works is a bit different from other CRPGs out there, which really resonates with people to begin with, but that's a whole different conversation. Long story short, stealth is certainly possible in plenty of CRPGs, but it tends to be a bit of a hassle for one reason or another, but it's usually one of those two, and it gets old quick. Speaking of using parties, however, one of the more, I would say, larger nuisances that CRPGs can give you is that when your main character dies, the party is completely wiped out, and you get a game over. This is annoying because oftentimes these games will have some sort of resurrection mechanic for companions and the like, but if your main character dies, that's it, it's all done. Couldn't possibly have them resurrected after the fact, and while there are plenty of games that don't do this, in fact they take the more party-based approach where it makes sense, I find this especially annoying because it kind of fundamentally changes how you have to approach combat, because you can really mess yourself up by playing either too aggressive with your main character or putting them in more danger than they should be, I suppose you could say. And so what ultimately happens here is you wind up revolving your tactics around protecting this main character, which also then affects the builds you're likely to put on that character. And so it's a seemingly small enough decision that then has these like cascading effects on how you're playing the game. And I find the constraints of that to be especially annoying. And that's, on top of the fact that like maybe an enemy gets a lucky crit on your character right as the combat encounter kicks off, and then like you've immediately lost and have to just reload again. And it's just very dumb. Not a huge fan of that at all. Speaking of play styles, though, another pet peeve of mine is options that never get properly utilized. So the thing about creating a character and making them, hyper-specialized potentially, or simply just having so many options to parse through that you can't possibly pick everything, etc. What happens, unfortunately, sometimes is that a lot of these options are simply not made equal, both in terms of power, but also sometimes simply in terms of representation. And what I mean by that is that there are CRPGs where picking a particular, say, skill type or talent or whatever else just doesn't really have good opportunities to shine. To give a nice, simple, easy example of this, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. That game, one of my personal favorites, imported a bunch of its classes and stuff from Kingmaker, which came before it. Kingmaker has an interesting archetype for your druid known as the Defender of the True World. It gets a bunch of bonuses to fighting Fae-type creatures. Totally fine. They brought that forward into Wrath of the Righteous, however, which sees you primarily fighting demons. There aren't a lot of Fae in that game, which means effectively what you've done is you've made this particular archetype, let's say, undesirable at best. And to Owlcat's credit, they do try to fix some of this stuff where they see it, like the Assassin Prestige class was basically useless when it launched, and then over time with patches and stuff, they changed how its poison applied, which made it actually able to apply said poisons to demons who are typically immune to those things. And so some options in the character creator are effectively traps for inexperienced people to fall into because they don't understand that what they're picking is not going to be effective for a variety of reasons. Now, Pathfinder is pretty notorious for this because of how complicated the system is, but you do also see it elsewhere with like various skills and things that just don't come up quite as often. To give a slightly different example, Pillars of Eternity 2 has cultures you can pick as your background. One of them is for the Deadfire Archipelago, which is in fact the archipelago the game takes place in. Unsurprisingly, that background option has way more interactivity than all of the rest of them, meaning that if you know you're only going to play through that game probably one time, picking the Deadfire Archipelago as your character's sort of background is going to probably get you the most interactive experience from that specific option, whereas the others are way, way less. This is going purely off memory, but if I'm not mistaken, the Archipelago option has like 3 times as many instances of like popping up in conversations and stuff as opposed to the others. But that example does actually lead me into my final pet peeve, which was especially prominent in older CRPGs. You actually see newer ones trying to tackle this issue, but it does come up even in recent times, and that is kind of the opposite of the last pet peeve, where things like attributes or particular skills, things like that, are weighted so heavily that they are the obvious option, that not picking it is actively making the game more difficult. Now, older CRPGs did this a lot with their attributes in particular, where stuff like intelligence would get you like extra skill points every level, extra experience earned, and that's a very, very sizable buff, and combine that with whatever is giving you action points for the turn-based or real-time with pause system, etc., whatever makes you attack more and affect the action economy, basically. And you're looking at what is probably going to be the most effective way to play that game. This is something even modern CRPGs do. I recently played an indie, Sector Unknown, that did this. Wasteland 3 from not all that long ago did this with its intelligence. But truth be told, it doesn't even necessarily need to be an attribute or anything. Divinity Original Sin 2, that is a game that put way too much weight in summoning because of the way that game's action economy worked, giving basically any character the ability to summon and provide distractions for enemies to waste their turn attacking is a massive increase to power, to the point where even these days when I play that game, I'm more than likely going to run at least 2 summoners because it adds massive amounts of action economy to your side. And while, given the nature of single-player games, I certainly don't expect the game to ever be like perfectly balanced or anything like that. That's just never going to happen. But a lot of times, just in playing these games for a short while, it's pretty easy to identify, especially when you've played a lot of CRPGs, what the clearly over-the-top thing is and just lean fully into it. And this also sort of leads into the problem I mentioned a little bit earlier, where it starts to affect play styles after a certain point, because if there's a very clear correct option, so to speak, when it comes to building out a character this way, then what you're probably going to do is then pick a play style that matches those things more easily. In fact, I'll give you a super recent example, Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3 has a lot of charisma checks, meaning that if you play a build for your main character that utilizes charisma as its primary stat, like a sorcerer, you're going to have a character that not only is capable of dominating combat, but also does extremely well in more social situations, which, because of how Baldur's Gate 3 handles its conversations generally and like who's speaking and everything, people can sort of slip into that and never break out of it. Now, the beauty of Baldur's Gate 3 actually is that is an incredibly reactive game that for the most part does a really good job of making other options very memorable and worth experiencing as well. And you definitely don't have to do that, but like I said, it starts to influence play styles when it gets egregious. And with these games being single-player experiences, I don't think the answer is necessarily to make that thing that is fun worse in some way, but rather try to make the other options more appealing as well in the way, say, Baldur's Gate 3 does. Now, my final CRPG pet peeve is YouTube channels named Mortismal Gaming that spend entirely too much time talking and making senseless lists, so right now, it's definitely time to go ahead and end the video before this becomes a problem. And so, that's where I'm going to end it. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know things you either love or get slightly annoyed by when it comes to CRPGs, I suppose. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.